Book 3, Chapter 5 of The Food of the Gods and How It Came to Earth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alex Heatelander, Davis, California. The Food of the Gods and How It Came to Earth by H.G. Wells. Book 3, Chapter 5. The Giant Leaguer. 1. Presently Redwood found himself in a train going south over the Thames. He had a brief vision of the river shining under its lights, and of the smoke still going up from the place where the shell had fallen on the north bank, and where a vast multitude of men had been organized to burn the Heracleophobia out of the ground. The southern bank was dark; for some reason even the streets were not lit. All that was clearly visible was the outlines of the tall alarm towers, and the dark bulks of flats and schools, and after a minute of peering scrutiny he turned his back on the window and sank into thought. There was nothing more to see or do until he saw the suns. He was fatigued by the stresses of the last 2 days. It seemed to him that his emotions must needs be exhausted, but he had fortified himself with strong coffee before starting, and his thoughts ran thin and clear. His mind touched many things. He reviewed again, but now in the enlightenment of accomplished events, the manner in which the food had entered and unfolded itself in the world. Bensington thought it might be an excellent food for infants, he whispered to himself, with a faint smile. Then there came into his mind, as vivid as if they were still unsettled, his own horrible doubts, after he had committed himself by giving it to his own son. From that, with a steady unfaltering expansion, in spite of every effort of men to help and hinder, the food had spread through the whole world of man. And now, "Even if they kill them all," Redwood whispered, "the thing is done." The secret of its making was known far and wide. That had been his own work. Plants, animals, a multitude of distressful, growing children would conspire irresistibly to force the world to revert again to the food, whatever happened in the present struggle. "The thing is done," he said, with his mind swinging round beyond all his controlling to rest upon the present fate of the children and his son. Would he find them exhausted by the efforts of the battle, wounded, starving, on the verge of defeat, or would he find them still stout and hopeful, ready for the still grimmer conflict of the morrow? His son was wounded, but he had sent a message. His mind came back to his interview with Kataham. He was roused from his thoughts by the stopping of his train in Chislehurst station. He recognized the place by the huge rat alarm tower that crested Camden Hill, and the row of blossoming giant hemlocks that lined the road. Kataham's private secretary came to him from the other carriage, and told him that half a mile farther the line had been wrecked, and that the rest of the journey was to be made in a motor car. Redwood descended upon a platform lit only by a hand lantern, and swept by the cool night breeze. The quiet of that derelict, wood-set, weed-embedded suburb, for all the inhabitants had taken refuge in London at the outbreak of yesterday's conflict, became instantly impressive. His conductor took him down the steps to where a motor car was waiting with blazing lights, the only lights to be seen, handed him over to the care of the driver, and bade him farewell. "You will do your best for us," he said, with an imitation of his master's manner, as he held Redwood's hand. So soon as Redwood could be wrapped about they started out into the night. At one moment they stood still, and then the motor car was rushing softly and swiftly down the station incline. They turned one corner and another, followed the windings of a lane of villas, and then before them stretched the road. The motor droned up to its topmost speed, and the black night swept past them. Everything was very dark under the starlight, and the whole world crouched mysteriously and was gone without a sound. Not a breath stirred the flying things by the wayside. The deserted, pallid white villas on either hand, with their black unlit windows, reminded him of a noiseless procession of skulls. The driver beside him was a silent man, or stricken into silence by the conditions of his journey. He answered Redwood's brief questions in monosyllables, and gruffly. Athwart the southern sky the beams of searchlights waved noiseless passes. The sole strange evidences of life they seemed in all that derelict world about the hurrying machine. The road was presently bordered on either side by gigantic blackthorn shoots that made it very dark, and by tall grass and big campions, huge giant dead nettles as high as trees, flickering past darkly in silhouette overhead. Beyond Keston they came to a rising hill, and the driver went slow. At the crest he stopped. The engine throbbed and became still. "There," he said, and his big gloved finger pointed, a black misshapen thing before Redwood's eyes. Far away as it seemed, the great embankment, crested by the blaze from which the searchlights sprang, rose up against the sky. Those beams went and came among the clouds and the hilly land about them, as if they traced mysterious incantations. "I don't know," said the driver at last, and it was clear he was afraid to go on. Presently a searchlight swept down the sky to them, stopped as it were with a start, scrutinized them, a blinding stare, confused rather than mitigated by an intervening monstrous weed stem or so. They sat with their gloves held over their eyes, trying to look under them and meet that light. "Go on," said Redwood after a while. The driver still had his doubts. He tried to express them, and died down to "I don't know" again. At last he ventured on. "Here goes," he said, and roused his machinery to motion again, followed intently by that great white eye. To Redwood it seemed for a long time they were no longer on earth, but in a state of palpitating hurry through a luminous cloud. Toof, 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 toof went the machine, and ever and again, obeying I know not what nervous impulse, the driver sounded his horn. They passed into the welcome darkness of a high fenced lane, and down into a hollow, and past some houses into that blinding stare again. Then for a space the road ran naked across a down, and they seemed to hang, throbbing in immensity. Once more giant weeds rose about them and whirled past. Then quite abruptly close upon them loomed the figure of a giant, shining brightly where the searchlight caught him below, and black against the sky above. "Hallo there!" he cried, and "Stop! There's no more road beyond. Is that Father Redwood?" Redwood stood up and gave a vague shout by way of answer, and then Coster was in the road beside him, gripping both hands with both of his and pulling out of the car. "What of my son?" asked Redwood. "He's all right," said Coster. "They hurt nothing serious in him." "And your lads?" "Well, all of them well, but we've had to make a fight for it." The giant was saying something to the motor driver. Redwood stood aside as the machine wheeled round, and then suddenly Coster vanished, everything vanished, and he was in absolute darkness for a space. The glare was following the motor back to the crest of the Keston Hill. He watched the little conveyance receding in that white halo. It had a curious effect, as though it was not moving at all, and the halo was. A group of war-blasted giant elders flashed into gaunt, scarred gesticulations, and was swallowed again by the night. Redwood turned to Coster's dim outline and clasped his hand. "I have been shut up and kept in ignorance," he said, "for 2 whole days." "We fired the food at them," said Coster. "Obviously. 30 shots, eh?" "I come from Caterham." "I know you do," he laughed with a note of bitterness. "I suppose he's wiping it up." 2. "Where is my son?" said Redwood. "He is all right. The giants are waiting for your message." "Yes, but my son—" He passed with Coster down a long slanting tunnel that was lit red for a moment, then became dark, and came out presently into the great pit of shelter the giants had made. Redwood's first impression was of an enormous arena bounded by very high cliffs, and with its floor greatly encumbered. It was in darkness save for the passing reflection of the watchmen's searchlights that whirled perpetually high overhead, and for a red glow that came and went from a distant corner where 2 giants worked together amidst a metallic clangor. Against the sky, as the glare came about, his eye caught the familiar outlines of the old work sheds and play sheds that were made for the Coster boys. They were hanging now, as it were, at a cliff brow, and strangely twisted and distorted with the guns of Canahan's bombardment. There were suggestions of huge gun emplacements above there, and nearer were piles of mighty cylinders that were perhaps ammunition. All about the wide space below, the forms of great engines and incomprehensible bulks were scattered in vague disorder. The giants appeared and vanished among these masses, and in the uncertain light, great shapes they were, not disproportionate to the things amidst which they moved. Some were actively employed, some sitting and lying as if they courted sleep, and one near at hand, whose body was bandaged, lay on a rough litter of pine boughs, and was certainly asleep. Redwood peered at these dim forms. His eyes went from one stirring outline to another. "Where is my son, Coster?" Then he saw him. His son was sitting under the shadow of a great wall of steel. He presented himself as a black shape recognizable only by his pose; his features were invisible. He sat chin upon hand, as though weary or lost in thought. Beside him Redwood discovered the figure of the princess, the dark suggestion of her merely, and then, as the glow from the distant iron returned, he saw for an instant, red-lit and tender, the infinite kindliness of her shadowed face. She stood looking down upon her lover with her hand resting against the steel. It seemed that she whispered to him. Redwood would have gone towards them. "Presently," said Coster. "First there is your message." "Yes," said Redwood, "but—" He stopped. His son was now looking up and speaking to the princess, but in too low a tone for them to hear. Young Redwood raised his face, and she bent down towards him, and glanced aside before she spoke. "But if we are beaten?" they heard the whispered voice of young Redwood. She paused, and the red blaze showed her eyes bright with unshed tears. She bent nearer him and spoke still lower. There was something so intimate and private in their bearing, in their soft tones, that Redwood, who had thought for 2 whole days of nothing but his son, felt himself intrusive there. Abruptly he was checked. For the first time in his life, perhaps, he realized how much more a son may be to his father than a father can ever be to a son. He realized the full predominance of the future over the past. Here between these two he had no part. His part was